What's up guys, HCZ here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we have the new ban list, and since not so many exciting stuff happened and the format is going to be pretty much exactly the same, I think it's time to take a look at some decks that actually got a huge change from the list, because even though the meta decks are as relevant as pretty much as they used to be, we have some other contenders that are getting back some stuff. Not a lot, but I feel like with the future ban list we can see that these decks are going to get a lot more cards eventually, because when Konami puts something in the semi-limited list, you can say very confidently that it's going to 3 next list, unless this card is malicious, of course. So yeah, we're going to take a look at Pendulum Magicians today, because I think that this is a deck that, even though it probably will never get Electromite back from the looks of things, all these other cards that it has on the list, if it keeps getting them back eventually, then it's going to become really powerful, because aside from Double Iris and Joker, there are so many other cards that are banned compared to any other Pendulum deck. For example, cards like Astrograph or Starving Venom, cards that without Electromite are not going to be as broken as they used to be when they were broken, so there might be a chance of them coming back. But now let's take a look at the cards that we got back and exactly how this affected the deck. But before we begin, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So fresh off the list, we have 3 copies of Double Iris Magician. This card makes the deck work, because before the deck was just a rank 4 spam turbo that you could not do much, because if you wanted to do more, you would have to use other guard dragons. This is not possible anymore. You would have to use Dagda for Scythe. This was another brick in the deck that didn't have a lot of synergy, because you would have to go for first Dagda and then go into a Tornado Dragon, which you would need a really good hand to do that, a hand that was not going to get hand trapped. So I think relying on the Pendulum graphs for disruption and the rank 4s, which are inherently good and you go into them for the deck, is actually a much better strategy, and that's how Pendulum Magicians worked in the past, and I think that's how they should be working today. So this is why I think having this card at 3 makes it so much better, because you're going to see it more consistently and you're going to pop it to search your Pendulum graphs to go even further. 3 copies of Purple Poison Magician. The reason this card is at 3 is because I cut the Dark Worm Engine. I think that you don't really need it anymore, just because you play one-offs in the deck that rely on you not playing another card, which is why I've cut a lot of other cards as well. So I think playing this as a low scale is much better, because this card going second makes the deck so much more powerful and so much more threatening, because with cards like Pendulum Sorcerer, you can pop this whenever you want, and then your opponent is going to have to get threatened to either negate the Pendulum Sorcerer's effect before this card gets popped, otherwise they're going to lose a monster, and if it stays on the field, then you can just attack with a Dark Spellcaster and then pop it with its own effect to pop another card. So I think this card makes really good sense to be a 3-off. I don't really get it why people play less than 3, because this card is a low scale, which the deck really needs, especially now because of Double Iris, because we have 3 high scales now, and Purple Poison is just a really good card to have. And it's a monster that sometimes, in the worst case scenarios, it's a monster that you can summon, crush on something, get rid of a Floodgate, maybe get rid of an anti-spell, an Imperial Order, stuff like that, cards that this deck just absolutely loses to. So I think this card at 3 is absolutely mandatory. 2 copies of Black Fang. This is another card that I see a lot of value during the grind game, because this deck will go to grind games a lot. It's not like the old Pendulum decks where you would make like 5-6 negates and your opponent was not going to be able to play, and then they would scoop and you would go to game 2. No, this deck is going to grind, because you're not bringing out so many interruptions. You try to out-resource your opponent, and this is another card that helps you do that, because it has the ability to bring back cards from the graveyard when it's destroyed, and it's also a high scale. So if you don't really want to scale your Double Iris and maybe you want to summon it or something like that, then this is another really good scale you can put. And it also has another effect that cuts the attack of an opponent's monster in half, which can come up a lot when you're trying to beat over big monsters. So yeah, this card is actually really used. 2 copies of Off Dragon, another card that helps you grind, because this card just keeps giving you advantage back your extra deck. It's a low scale, and all of those magicians you can just go with Wisdom Might. So depending on what you need, you can go for the high scale or low scale, or if you have both, you can go for the scale you want with the appropriate effect. So yeah, these cards are all really helpful. 3 copies of Wisdom Might. This card I think is still the best magician. With Harmonizing, those 2 cards are just so good. Wisdom Might just gets you to any one of your scales. An amazing card. 3 copies of Harmonizing, another great card. It gives you an access to an instant rank 4 Xyz or a level 8 Synchro, whatever you need. Usually turn 1 you're gonna go for your Xyz plays, because the only negate you can get by using a Synchro is Savage, but usually you're not going to have a Link in the Grave turn 1 unless you open a really good hand where you can go for the Halki Fibrax combo turn 1 to go for Appaloosa. Then yes, then you can go for your Savage to get negates, but still sometimes just sitting on a Dweller, especially this format, is good enough to win sometimes. 3 copies of Tuning Magician. This card is a card that was never a good card in this deck, but ever since Halki Fibrax came out, it's just such a great card, because it gives you access to a Hulk play with Selene before you even Pendulum Summon. So sometimes you can make an Appaloosa before you Pendulum Summon, so you can play around Nibiru. Going second, you can go into Access Code before Pendulum Summoning to force your opponent to do something, otherwise they're going to lose their entire board. So this is why this card, just giving you a tuner on the field, as long as you have 2 magicians, is absolutely important. And also you can use this as a free discard fodder for cards like Pendulum Call, because you can get it back from the graveyard as well. So yeah, this card is so good. Being able to go into Hulk is absolutely worth. 1 copy of Dragon Pit. This is a card that you just have here just in case, because you don't really want to play any effective backrow removal card, at least not in the main deck. You're going to side cards like Twisters, Feather Duster, Lightning Storm, and stuff like that, obviously, but you don't really want to main those cards in a deck like this, because Pendulums are a deck that usually you can use your entire hand turn 1 and then keep getting cards back out of the cards you have on the field with cards like your Pendulum Graphs, with cards like your Oath Dragon and your Black Fang, so you don't really have cards to discard even if you set a Twisters, and going second, you don't really need cards like that because cards like Dragon Pit exist. This card is very accessible, and just by discarding a Pendulum, you can pop a back row, and you can get this with cards like Wisdom Might, you can get Pendulum Call. It's very easy to get to, so this is why I think it's much better playing this one-off than playing any other back row removal in the main deck. For the Performapals, we have 2 copies of Skullcrobat Joker, and you can be 99% certain this card is going to 3 during the next list, because Konami has finally realized that this card is not as broken as other Pendulum cards used to be, because cards like Monkey Board, yes, they could never come back to 3, but this card commits to a normal summon, so it doesn't give you and says scales, of course, because though it has to be on the field, so you search one of the 2 scales. Monkey Board is half the scale, it doesn't commit to your normal summon, and it gets you the high scale as well, so it's much more broken than Joker, so there's absolutely no problem with Joker being at 3. It's just a really good normal summon for Pendulums, and since we have 2, now we can search it even more consistently, because before when we had 1, it prevented you from playing certain cards that I think are really good in Pendulums, but you didn't really want to play them just because you had one-offs that you could not get access to without searching them immediately or hard drawing them. But yeah, now you have 2, so you can play some other cards. We also play 3 copies of Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer. You need to play 3 just because now you can search multiple Jokers, because you have another Performapal that you play in the deck, but before with 1 Joker you didn't really need. You could play 3 Pendulum Sorcerer before as well, of course, but after you use the first one, usually the other 2 were going to be dead. So this is why Sorcerer Rat now at 3 is absolutely crucial, because getting to your Joker is important, and not only that, it pops your own scale. So going first, you can pop your Double Iris to search your Pendulum Graph. Going second, you can pop your Purple Poison to pop monsters and cards your opponent has on the field, so it gives you a lot of direct synergy with Magicians as well, on top of searching you the searcher of the deck that searches pretty much every monster in the deck. And the other Performapal is Performapal Celestial Magician. This is another option that you can get if you already have Joker, or if you want to search 2 with Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer. This card just gives you a follow-up. It's like the old Kirin Pendulum, the Xyz monster that we used to summon. It was rank 4 that during the end phase you were going to search a Pendulum monster. It basically does the same thing. So you get a search during the end phase, so you can get another monster for the next step. And the extender that I chose to play is 3 copies of Abyss Actor Curtain Raiser. The reason this card I think is much better than all the other extenders, cards like Chronograph, cards like Darkworm, is because it's a card that standalone does a lot, and it doesn't require you to play cards that you don't really want to see in your hand. For example, when you're playing Darkworm, you don't really want to see your Gate 0, or Darkworm to be exact, because you don't want to commit your normal summon to Darkworm, especially now that you have 2 Jokers, and Chronograph always, you never want to draw your Time Gazer. So I think this card, just having a level 4 monster on the field is very important, and I also play a monster in the extra deck that complements this card, because there's going to be a certain card in this format that we're going to see a lot more, because Konami just doesn't want to hit anything related to this card, so I think having an out to it is very important, but I'm going to explain once I get to the extra deck. For the spells, we have 3 copies of Duelist Alliance. Of course, this card searches you so much stuff. It searches you your Pendulum Graphs, your Pendulum Call, your Double Iris, your Pendulum Sorcerer. It searches you pretty much so many cards that you need, so it's such an important card. 1 copy of Pendulum Call. Honestly, this is a card that I'm considering cutting every time I play this deck, but there have been some scenarios where you want to search this card because your hands are just so bad that you need exact 2 scales to get, and even if you lock yourselves from destroying your scales or activating your Pendulums before, it's still a decent card, but I can see why people have started debating about this card, because it's a card that contradicts with the entire strategy of the deck, but it also helps it at the same time, so it's in a very weird spot. So I think a one-off is absolutely fine, just in case the scenario comes up when your hand is going to be absolutely awful, so you need to get 2 specific scales to be able to play. 2 copies of Star Pendulum Graph. This is a card that I don't see a lot of people play more than 1, and I think that this card is so much better than Pendulum Call, because it just gives you constant advantage. It basically does the same thing if you have a half-decent play, so if you can pop one of your scales with either your Wisdom Eyes effect or your Pendulum Sorcerer's effect, you get another scale, and then during your following turns you can keep doing this, so you get constant advantage with this card, and if your opponent doesn't deal with it, you're going to get so many cards in your hand that you're not going to be able to lose the grind game. So this is why I think this card is a really good card, and I think at 2-off it's been overperforming, and this is why I played at 2. Not 3 would be a little bit overkill, but definitely not a 1-off, which most people play. 3 copies of Desires. This is the reason I was talking about that before. When you had 1 Joker, if you were not drawing it or if you were not searching in turn 1, it was basically like the field spell of Salamangreats. You either had to get it ASAP, or you are going to activate this while risking you're never getting to it. But of course, getting to Joker is not as simple as Salamangreats getting to Sanctuary, so you couldn't really play Desires. I mean, you could, but it was going to be very risky. But now with 2 Jokers and eventually with 3 Jokers, this card is just going to be so much more important, and it's another reason why I cut cards like Chronograph and Darkworm, because they do play searchable one-offs that you don't want to play more than one because you don't want to draw them, but if you banish them, then they lose all their value. So this is why Curtain Raiser is a much better extender when you play Desires, and I really like Desires in the deck because Pendulum decks need as many cards as possible in order to do a bigger play. It's not like they're like Prank Kids where they have one card combos. No, you need to play a lot of cards in your hand in order to be able to do a good field, so this is why Desires helps a lot with that. And the only trap is 2 copies of Time Pendulum Graph, of course. This is another card that just helps you absolutely destroy your opponent with combination with cards like Time Star. You can send cards to the grave with Purple Poison, you can pop 2. It has so much value. Using this during your opponent's turn, during your own turn, just gives you all the destruction you need. And on top of that, if you combine this with rank 4 monsters and level 8 Synchros and Appaloosa, this is what the deck tries to do, and this is how to disrupt your opponent. For the extra deck, for the Synchro monsters, we have 1 copy of Ignister. You don't need to play more than 1. You hardly ever summon this, to be honest. It's just here just to make combo with Purple Poison, because there are some cards that you're not going to be able to deal with without this card because it's a non-targeting spin. And then on top of that, if you pop your scales, you can get even more effects, which is good. You could play the Draco Slayer engine, to be honest, if you want to get more value out of this card, because with 3 copies of Double Iris, you can get your Luster Pendulum's effect by destroying it, searching another one, and then getting your Double Iris effect. The problem is that their scales are very awkward because scale 5 is not the best thing in the world in this deck, because if you search your Double Iris, then you're not going to be able to scale this. You need to be able to scale a low level in order to go for your level 4 monsters, so sometimes it can be a little bit contradictory, but it's a card that you can consider if you want to get the most value out of this monster. 1 copy of Savage Dragon. Of course, I mentioned that turn 1, if you don't get access to your Tuning Magician, usually you're not going to have a Link monster in the graveyard, but if you do, you can have either a Linkuriboh or a Hulky Fabrics in the graveyard to go for this to get even more interruption. 1 copy of Supreme King Dragon Clearwing. This is a card that just absolutely destroys boards. I feel like I'm going to this card a lot more than I'm going to Ignister, just because there are not so many boards that can withstand this card. Maybe if your opponent has Dragoon, then yes, Ignister is much better, but this card just gives you a lot more value. For the Xyz monsters, we play 1 copy of Time Star. You could play 2, because sometimes you just need the effect to protect a monster to go for your Time Pendulum Graph, but it's a monster you can bring back from the grave with your Black Fang as well, so I don't really see myself summoning more than 1. There have been some games, but I just like having more variety in the extra deck, because the toolbox stuff in the extra deck just help you deal with certain matchups, because Pendulums in the main deck do pretty much the same thing. They don't interact with your opponent very well, of course, except your Dragon Pit, because you can pop back row, but the rest of the stuff are very generic, so you need to be more specific with your extra deck depending on what you want to deal. 1 copy of Supreme King Dragon Dark Rebellion. This is the OTK machine. This is just such a good card. If you were considering playing cards like Utopia Double in a deck like this, you don't really need to, just because a card like this exists, because it gives you so much damage. Yes, it doesn't one-shot your opponent, but if you only have this monster on the field, then something went wrong and your combo didn't go as planned, so yeah, you were not going to resolve Utopia Double anyway, so usually you're going to have this with a couple more monsters on the field to be able to OTK your opponent. 1 copy of Tornado Dragon. Even though you don't play Scythe this particular build, I still feel like Tornado Dragon is a really good card, because when you're playing against a full back or heavy deck, Dragon Pit just doesn't do the job on its own, but if you have cards like Tornado Dragon in your Pendulum Graph, then you can absolutely destroy those types of decks, so I really like this card. 1 copy of Abyss Dweller. This card, like before, the format didn't change. It's a really good card against decks like Tri-Brigade, Prank Kids, Drytron. This card is an absolute beast. If you summon this and you resolve this, and your opponent is most likely not going to do much, and you can just come back and OTK them during the next time. I do play 1 Utopia with 1 Utopia the Lightning. I do not play Utopia Double. I'm not playing these just because of this reason. I'm playing these because of Dragoon, because Konami again missed all the cards really Dragoon. Anaconda is legal, Red Ice Fusion is legal, and of course Dragoon is legal. So you need to be able to deal with Dragoon before you commit to a Pendulum summon, just because if your opponent knows what he's doing, they're going to negate the most crucial play you're going Dragoon. But with cards like Curtain Raiser, maybe you can just normal summon a level 4, then special summon your Curtain Raiser, and then you can just have a Utopia the Lightning that will deal with the Dragoon right away. And even if your opponent negates your Skullcrobat Joker and then you cannot go into rank 4 before you Pendulum summon, you can just go into Ignister and deal with Dragoon this way. So you have a way to deal with Dragoon preemptively before you Pendulum summon, and after you Pendulum summon if your opponent has already used the negate. So this is why I really like this package in the deck, and as long as Dragoon is still illegal, then we're going to be using cards like this, because you don't want to lose to a single monster that people are going to be playing just because it did not get hit on the list. For the Link monsters, we have 1 copy of Linkuriboh. Sometimes you need to be able to go and to link your Harmonizing away, not your Harmonizing, sorry, your Tuning Magician away, so you can get it back from the graveyard to go into Hulk this way, which makes you go into Selene and Access Code or Appaloosa before you even commit to a Pendulum summon, just because you can normal summon your Tuning Magician, and then after you get your negates, protect yourself from Nibiru, or you try to bait your opponent's negates by threatening break their board with Access Code, then you can Pendulum summon and duel your plays. 1 copy of Masquerena. This is another card that you can go into. Sometimes you can summon Dweller and go into Masquerena with cards like Tornado Dragon, and after you've used your Dweller's effect and after you've used your Tornado Dragon's effect, you can use this card to go into Appaloosa, because sometimes you're not going to be able to go into Appaloosa before you Pendulum summon, and if you Pendulum summon and hard summon Appaloosa afterwards, you're losing a lot of monsters. So this is why I think Masquerena helps you a lot, because it gives you first the value of your rank 4 monster, monsters, and then you can go into Appaloosa, and you don't really care about those monsters going back because you're going to be Pendulum summoning a lot of monsters again during the next turn anyway, so you're not going to be able to get grinded by your opponent, while on top of getting all the rank 4's effects and the Appaloosa negates. One copy of Halki Fibrax, of course, there's nothing to explain about this card, it's just so broken. Same thing with Selene, this card gives you back your monsters, and you go into either Access Code Talker, which is when you're going second, you're trying to break boards, or into the one copy of Appaloosa if you want to protect yourself from Nibiru. And because Nibiru is such a good card this format, I think it's much more important to try to do this before you Pendulum summon, because after you've Pendulum summoned, if you get Nibiru, it's very difficult to get something on the field. You have to rely completely on your Pendulum Graph to outgrind your opponent and stop them from destroying you. So this is why I think harmonizing and tuning give you all these extra cards on the field, so you can either keep resources or make Appaloosa before you Pendulum summon to protect yourself from cards like that. So yeah, that's the deck, guys. Pendulum Magician, I think, is probably the most fun favorite Pendulum deck, and it's my personal favorite as well. I think it's the most fun Pendulum deck that I've ever played, and I really love it. So this is why I try to keep innovating and trying to get as many cards back from the ban list, and with each and every card that we get back, we get this card, this level of power that this deck used to have, but of course it's never going to be the same without Electromite, but still we're going to use what we have. So I know that all the Pendulum players out there, they're going to make these decks work eventually. So yeah, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.